And finally, before we move on, we should cover the issue of whitespace handling. So whitespace pretty much consists of all the carriage returns, line feeds, tabs, and space characters that occur in your documents. You can go ahead and just go to town and add whitespace to your documents to make them more readable wherever you decide to add it. The XML parser basically ignores whitespace unless it happens to occur inside an element. And in that case, it passes the whitespace along to the application as a part of the character data for that element. Now, the XML spec says that the parser should not try to guess what the whitespace means. In other words, the parser shouldn't try to guess, well, is this whitespace here to make things more readable, or is the whitespace here because it's actually meaningful in the document's text? So XML provides a predefined attribute, XML:space, to control what happens. Now, regardless of what you set this attribute to, the parser is always going to pass the whitespace along to the underlying application because that's what the XML spec says it has to do. It's up to the application to decide what it wants to do with the whitespace that it encounters. And there's two different values that you can specify for this attribute. The first is the string default, in which case the application should just use whatever its default settings are for handling whitespace. The second value is preserve, which tells the application that it should try to preserve all the whitespace that it comes across, regardless of where it sees it inside elements. So to make this a little bit more clear, let's take a look at an example. In the top part of the example, there's element A, element B, and element C. And you can see that elements B and element C have been indented underneath element A to make them more readable, which means that after the closing tag for the element A, there's a carriage return there, and then there's a tab in front of both elements B and C. And then there's another carriage return at the end of element C right before element A. So this whitespace is there just to make things more readable. If you look down in the second example, however, this is a case where the whitespace is actually a part of the element's information. So in the signature tag, all that whitespace in front of the word sincerely is really supposed to be there. And the desire in this case would be to have that whitespace transferred through to the application so it would show up in the output. Now, again, as I said earlier, each application gets to decide how it wants to handle whitespace. So it's really up to the application to make that decision. Let's take it as an example, Internet Explorer. In Internet Explorer, the way whitespace is handled depends on how you are displaying the XML data. If you are using CSS style sheets, as we'll see later in the title, to display XML data, then Internet Explorer will treat whitespace the same way that it treats it in HTML. In other words, it will condense a series of whitespace characters down into one single whitespace character, and it will discard all the whitespace that is leading or trailing in an element. So in the second example there, it would simply discard all of the whitespace in front of the word sincerely. And if there were a series of spaces between, say, the sincerely and the comma and my name, it would condense all of the whitespace down into a single space character. On the other hand, if you are using data binding, again, as we'll see later in this title, to display the XML data, then Internet Explorer will preserve all of the whitespace within an XML element. So in that particular case, all the whitespace that you see before the word sincerely there would be transferred through to the output, and it would show up in the resulting page. And in the case of Internet Explorer, these two examples would happen that way regardless of however you specified the XML:space attribute. So again, the point here is that each application that is processing the XML gets to decide how it's going to handle the whitespace that appears in XML data.